Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast, a Tuesday edition of the show. I'm Matt Prehm, Erik Skopil, Jared Mack on today's pod. We've been able to speak with Dan Lanning Monday evening to get his early thoughts on this upcoming matchup, Oregon at Texas Tech, as well as now a couple of offensive players, ironically, two running backs, Bucky Irving and Jordan James. And then we've also got two defensive backs, Dante Manning, who started at corner, and also Nico Reed. Let's go first with injury news, because while Dan Lanning said Monday night he's not really going to discuss players who didn't play in a game the previous week, he said, like, paraphrasing, we'll go with the guys that we got. We're happy with the guys that we got. We're in a good place. And then from there, we'll see. On Tuesday, today, we went to practice, and that's where the most notable information from an injury standpoint, I think, we learned.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, it's very similar to the information we had going into the Portland State game where a bunch of players suddenly didn't play, because basically everybody who didn't play against Portland State that matters practiced on Tuesday. And I think if you go back and look at Tuesday's practice report, the case would be pretty similar. The three players who we did not spot, and therefore everybody else did practice, were Nishad Strother, Lipe Molala, and Tavita Pame. So there's three players who we did not see, along with Andrew Boyle, I should note. I don't know what's going on there, but you kind of wonder if he's still with the program. He was not there on Saturday. He was obviously last year's kickoff specialist. So with those three players being the only absences, you go, hey, Chris Hudson was there. Whittington was there. We saw Casey Kelly. We saw Mace Funa, Justin Jacobs, and Evan Williams. Those were a lot of the guys that we were kind of had question marks coming out of Saturday. I don't know if we have any more answers other than to say they all look like they were pretty close to being full participants. We should note Evan Williams still had his left hand wrapped, and Justin Jacobs was in trainers as he entered practice and was wearing those while we watched, but we did see him carrying cleats in. I don't know how much that matters or what that means exactly. Seems like it's probably a positive, but yeah, I don't know if there's a whole lot more. And the reason I'm not jumping for joy over all of these turned over leaves and all this information is because, as I said earlier, a week ago, we've probably had a lot of similar information, and then a lot of these guys didn't play on Saturday. So we'll see when we get down to Tech. If you are following any of the three of us on social media, I think you'll want to be kind of checking in about an hour before kickoff, when we start kind of seeing who's with the team and who looks like they're available. Because I don't know if we're going to have any more clarity than we do today. I would be very surprised if when Dan speaks on Wednesday, he shares anything more than what he said on Monday night. So this is probably the most information you're going to get this week leading in until shortly before kickoff.
Yep. No, that's exactly how it's going to be. I guess it was encouraging to see all of those guys at practice, but we saw all of them last week. So maybe it is encouraging. Maybe it's not, just exactly what Erik said. Other than that, practice, I don't know if we want to get into practice at all because there is absolutely nothing to see. But like special teams were the exact same. Luke Dunn had a few good punts. We'll see whoever kicks this weekend. But yeah, practice is exactly the same. So there's absolutely nothing going on there.
I had one more I wanted to say, which is Tatum Tuioti, who dressed for the game on Saturday, did not play. We saw him take part in practice for the first time since I wrote down August 11th. So that was encouraging. I don't think it's going to matter much. I don't know if he'll travel or not, or if he's even available to play, but that's like a encouraging development, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, that opens a comment that Erik of him traveling or not is this will give us a good indication of, like, I don't think Oregon's allowed to take like all 119 guys that they have on its roster, but this will give us an early kind of look of players they view the staff as being of guys who could potentially help or play in games, whether certain scenarios come up or injuries come up. We're gonna get a travel roster. I won't be surprised if some guys get left behind in Eugene. They don't, not literally left behind, but they don't get to travel, and that'll be interesting just to see who makes it, who doesn't make the travel roster. We talked about this ahead of practice. Like, well, if you go to duckterritory.com at some point on Saturday, we'll have, or maybe it's Sunday, depending on when we get it up, but We'll probably post the whole travel roster, what it looks like, and from each position group. But that'll give us a little bit of an insight into just where things fit from a player personnel perspective and where they fit on the depth chart. And I don't want to say who's more important than others, but at the same time, it gives you an idea of like, hey, we have to have X number of players at this position, or they're really thin at this position. That's why our freshman's going, or whatnot.
Yeah, and just one last thought on that. Matt brings up the right point. I don't know the restriction number, but non-conference road games, I think you are allowed to bring a little bit more than conference road games. So when Oregon plays at Stanford in 3 weeks' time, that'll give us an even better and clearer identification of like, these are the guys that they feel like they have to bring. Because I think it goes down by, I want to say 20, 25 players or something like that from, like, think back to the Georgia game last year. I think they traveled basically everybody.
They traveled everybody.
Yeah, and then the Washington State game, I think, was the first road game. And I remember we were like, oh, man, where's Byron Cardwell? Where's this guy? Where's that guy? And certain players who didn't make that trip turned out to be pretty notable. So, yeah, this is kind of where we are. This is kind of in no man's land. And we'll figure out on Saturday who made the trip. And there might be players who don't make the trip. And we won't have any more clarity for why, other than that they weren't there, because Dan has made it clear he's not talking about players who are absent. So it's kind of the situation we're at.
Going into this one, Oregon is going to be the highest ranked non-conference opponent that the Red Raiders have ever hosted since 1994, when then number 1 Nebraska came to town. So this is going to be probably their biggest game since then from a non-con perspective. There'll probably be bigger games when Texas Tech played and Oklahoma in the Big 12 or something of that nature, or Texas maybe. But this game should be one of the more higher profile matchups that they've had. It's sold out. It's been sold out for a while. Apparently they've got like a 25 or 27 game win streak in home openers that's on the line.
Yep.
And Dan Lanning, he didn't come out and challenge Texas Tech, but I think, Eric, you asked him the question of just kind of how do you prepare for this environment? And he was all excited about that. This is going to be a hostile place, and it should be raucous, and it should be sold out, and everyone should be, as he said, amped up, which is my read of there's probably going to be a lot of alcohol consumed before this game is kicked off by the fan bases.
Oh, I don't think there's any question about it. And yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think you expect this atmosphere to be really, really a difference maker. And that, I think if you're Oregon, your goal is to make it not a difference maker sooner than later, right? Try to get some points, try to build a lead, try to quiet that crowd. The longer you keep them in this game, or the longer the crowd still has something to cheer for, the longer they become and continue to be a problem for you. And I've not been at this venue. I've only heard really positive things. We're going to have Jarrett Johnson from InsideTheRedRaiders.com, our 24/7 sports affiliate, on, I think, on Wednesday, Matt. Is that right? He'll be on Wednesday's show.
Yes.
So we will get a little bit more of a feel for the atmosphere down there and everything. But yeah, I thought that stood out. Dan really, that was one of the first things he talked about when he sat down in his opening statements on Monday night, was respect for the opposition, but also a lot of respect for the environment that Oregon is entering on Saturday.
And he should. It's Texas football. It's a different stadium than it is to go to Austin or maybe to Oklahoma. But just because the size perspective of it, but it's going to be a very similar venue to what Autzen Stadium is. I think Texas Tech Stadium holds 60,000, so just a couple more thousand than what Autzen can hold. A lot of people across the country will say, "Oh, it's for Autzen." They say it's 57,000. How loud can it could be? And then they get here and it is loud. It's one of the louder ones in the country. It's going to be the same perspective at Texas Tech. It's going to be a smaller stadium. It's going to be more confined. It's going to be like when Oregon went to Washington State last year, and that place only holds 40, but it doesn't feel like it.
Yeah.
It's going to be a ruckus crowd, and that's fine. That's what Dan was saying. This is why they play the game. This is why he wants to coach Oregon football. This is why he recruits kids who he knows that can play in this type of environment. Oregon played in this type of environment multiple times last year. I guess probably the most hectic was that Washington State one. That was a pretty good one. Georgia was a little bit less because it was 80-20, but there's a lot of people in there. This is not something new for somebody like Bo Nix, who's been in the SEC and been in much more hostile crowds. This is not something new for even like Bucky Irving, who at Minnesota played at Ohio State. Like, this is going to be a tough environment. Don't get me wrong, but Oregon's here to play up to it. Oregon's there. They brought in all these guys to play in this environment and to come out with a victory. This is always why we play the games, because you never know what's going to happen. But I'm not surprised at all that Dan was like, all right, come on, bring it on. Let's do it. Like, because that's why he's here. That's why he brought his guys here.
Yeah, it would be a big concern if this team kind of melts under the pressure of a loud stadium, because they're going to play in bigger games, not necessarily bigger stadiums. They will, but bigger games than this one. And if the pressure of this game gets them, then that will be a bad sign for things to come, because they got to go to Utah. They got to go to Washington, and they could potentially be playing in the Pac-12 championship game against one of those two schools, fan base there as well. So I'm with Jared. Like, it'd be a big concern if this team is not prepared for the noise, the hostile environment. And we should note today at practice, you asked Erik also like how you prepare for the heat and whatnot. Dan didn't have the team in parkas, as he said on Monday night, but
we can confirm that. We can confirm on Tuesday. They were not in parkas on Tuesday.
Yes.
All right. Tyler Shough, former Oregon quarterback. Dan called him a winner. Said he's a better runner than maybe people give him credit for. We also got with Dante Manning today, and he gave I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but interesting comment about how like he was asked about, hey, like, you've played with him, what do you remember him? And he gave a bunch of different things, and then said, like, I remember how like he likes to hold the ball for a long time before throwing, or something of that nature, which was his knock when he was at Oregon. He took a long time to throw the football. Nonetheless, this is a guy that Dan seemed to have a lot of confidence in, a guy that he was very high on, and it's going to be interesting to see him play against Oregon. It's going to be interesting to see how Oregon defends the Texas Tech offense, which the DBs talked about it. Dan Lanning talked about just the offense, how they spread out. The receivers that they have are all pretty good. They've got some serious size on the outside. They've got a 6'9" tight end. This should be the true first test that we see for this Oregon defense.
I think with Tyler is, and this dates back to when he was Oregon, when he's comfortable and confident and gets into a rhythm, he can be a very capable quarterback and lead offenses. Like, think about the way he started at Oregon, those first 3 games in 2020. The type of performances you saw, I think everybody felt pretty darn good coming out of those first couple of games. I remember against Washington State, they got far behind, and then they had a pretty miraculous rally to take control and never looked back. And so you felt through 3 games really good, and then the wheels kind of fell off, and his play really was kind of in line with the team's lack of success. He started to struggle. He started to kind of doubt himself, and they started to insert Anthony Brown into some kind of series in the Pac-12 championship game, and then in the bowl game against Iowa State, there was almost like a full split there, and it just kind of snowballed from there. But that's carried over to his time at Texas Tech. He's not been healthy all that often. I think he played in only 11 games his first 2 years at Tech, and that's, I think, exclusively due to injury. But when he has played, to Matt's point and to Dan's point, they've been very successful. Before last weekend's loss to Wyoming, they were 8-3 in games that he had appeared in during his time there. You look back last year, they finished the regular season beating Oklahoma in double overtime. He threw for like 436 yards or something like that, which was a career high. Led them to some late points there to ensure the victory. He's had moments. He's shown he can lead Texas Tech to big wins. It's just mixed in there is a bunch of injuries, and then some games where he doesn't play very well. And that was, I think, an example against Wyoming where, yeah, he threw for 338 yards and I think 3 touchdowns, but there's some pretty iffy sequences there from Tyler. And I'm curious to hear what Jared will say from the Texas Tech site later this week about kind of the perception of Shough down in Lubbock. But he's a player that is certainly capable of leading an offense that could beat a team like Oregon. but he's also a player that has shown that if he gets rattled and doesn't have his confidence and just kind of gets out of rhythm, that he's a player that can kind of implode a little bit. And I really liked Tyler when he was here. I thought he handled himself really, really well off the field. And I still was really impressed after that Fiesta Bowl where he gets pulled and they lose and it's not a very competitive game. He doesn't play very well, that he made himself available afterwards to come out and take responsibility for everything. And shortly after that, he ends up hitting the portal. So I have a lot of respect for him. And I think he's capable of playing at a really high level. But that's the big question going into this week for me, is just what kind of a quarterback does Tech have down there? And will Tyler play at his best? Because if he does, I think this game can be very competitive.
Yeah, that's what Tech has been wondering for years now, is what kind of quarterback is Tyler Shough? Because like Erik ran through, he had played well in moments. He gets hurt a decent bit. I mean, he's had two basic season-ending injuries in back-to-back years where he either A, missed the rest of the season or missed a significant portion of the season. And so that never helps in development. He comes in there and last week against Wyoming, like Erik ran through, he had moments. If you watch that game from the second half on, you'd probably wonder if Tyler Shough is any good. But in the first quarter where they put up 17 points and he is commanding the offense, it's a run and gun, not a run and shoot, air raid offense where there's short passes. They're trying to get 6-7 yards a pop. He can do a very good job on that. It's when a defense begins to clamp down and forces him into third and long or third and very long, just situations where a team must throw the ball, is opportunities for a defense to do well against him. I think that his wide receiver core, which we can get into in just a second, is good. I think they're talented, but they're not the greatest group in the country. I think they can be covered. I think that they have opportunities, but they're not a big deep ball team. And I think Shough throws a really good deep ball. They can be at points. They like to, obviously it's an air raid, so they're going to try to go short and then beat you long when you're thinking it's going to be short. But I kind of like how Oregon's defense matches up in this case. I like the personnel that Oregon has in terms of these short yardage situations where you don't have to cover somebody one-on-one, because I'm not sure what that's going to look like yet, because they certainly weren't challenged by Portland State about that. But I think Oregon's defense can get their hands on some balls. And Dan Lanning talked about this last night where, they're going to emphasize putting their hands up as a defensive lineman and trying to swat these balls away at the line of scrimmage, because that was something that Wyoming was able to do. They had 4 batted balls last week. I think James Crepio of the Oregonian asked the question. He said that Joey McGuire he said that there were 2 that were probably on Shough and 2 that just kind of happened. If you're Oregon and you have guys like Casey Rogers, who are 6'5", Jordan Birch, who's 6'6", Brandon Dorlus, who's 6'3", like you have guys who are long-limbed and athletic, like that's an opportunity to help get yourself off the field, maybe force Texas Tech into third and long situations instead of like a 3rd and 4, 3rd and 6. I think there's opportunities for Oregon's defense to take advantage of what Shough isn't good at. But I think it's about not letting him get into a rhythm early in the game, because like he was in Wyoming, he got into a rhythm early. I know they got out of it, but with the home environment, with the crowd behind him, if he gets into a rhythm really early in the game, that could help them either stay in the game, take the lead, and take the win potentially.
Now, around Shough, there's a lot of talent. I think it starts, though, Erik wrote a story, Know Your Foe, 5 names to know. 3 of them are on offense. 1 is Shough. I think if we're not going to talk about Shough, the next guy is probably receiver Jared. Is that how we say it? There's
Jared.
An interesting name. Jared Bradley, a 6'5" sophomore who, as you called it, Erik, maybe the most physical receiver Oregon will see all year, which is saying something, because the league in the Pac-12 is loaded with really good receivers.
He's just a really unique player at 6'5", 220 who can run as well. And he did have some success down the field last year. He was one of the more productive receivers in the Big 12. I think I wrote in the story he was like 7th in the conference in receiving yards and 4th in touchdowns. He's a good player. And he's a guy who's going to cause matchup problems just with his size on the outside. We did talk a little bit with Dante Manning about that. He says you rely on your technique, you rely on your positioning. And in Dante's case, he didn't say this, you rely on your length. I know Dante's only 5'11", but he's got his arms. You can see it today standing there while he's being interviewed. Like he can almost scratch his knees with his arms. He's one of those guys who's just, I think he said last year, close to a 7-foot wingspan. So Oregon has size on the outside with him, with Kyrie, with Triquez. I wonder if we'll see maybe a little bit more Triquez in these situations because it's not just Bradley on the outside. This name, by the way, is way more hard to pronounce. Luke Fonji, and it's Loic and then Fouonji. He's 6'4". He's a senior. He's another jump ball guy on the outside. So they've got two guys like that that are problems on the outside, and it'll be, I think, a challenge for sure against a secondary which has had trouble in the past with some players sort of similar to this. But from a personnel perspective, at least, you've got players of similar size out there, and it'll be a matter of how they can kind of match up. Another thing Dan talked about at receiver was just the kind of creativity they have offensively and how they utilize them. Talked a lot about, he said that they were the most, or they utilized bunch and, group sets over on the outside more than any team in the country last season. Talked about the difficulty of when they're stacked or in a bunch set like that, of knowing where each player is going to go and being able to have the right communication, and how sometimes you get a situation where, hey, if the guys aren't communicating well and two players take a guy, that leaves one guy open. Those are the type of issues that Texas Tech tries to present. I don't know much of anything about this 6'9" tight end that James was talking about. I need to do my tight end research.
Neither do I.
I can tell you that he wears 3X size gloves per the game notes.
Wow,
it's in
very cool.
In the game notes. He was he played 412 offensive snaps last season, according to PFF, and that's the most among all tight ends that they had. And the key thing is he missed 3 games last year, so it feels like, well, maybe he's not the receiver threat that you would naturally think. It feels like he's always just on the field for various other reasons.
Yeah, and I know they added a tight end who from A&M a couple of years ago, who was like the number 1 ranked tight end recruit in the country in like 2018. He's the most highly rated recruit. That's another story you can check out on duckterritory.com on the Foe series. I did one looking at the top rated recruits. So they've got some talent there. I should note they also have some talent in the slot.
Yeah, I'm happy you brought him up because there's a connection with Oregon. Oregon offered this guy. They wanted him coming out of the portal.
There's 2 guys. First, I was going to bring up Miles Price, who has had over 500 yards receiving in 21 and 22. And then the other one is Dre McCray, which is the player that Matt was referencing, who Oregon was hot on his heels for a while out of Austin Peay. He had a big season a year ago, really dynamic. So they've got a great receiving core. Where would it stack up in totality against the teams Oregon to play this year? Well, it's certainly not better than USC or Washington, but it's possible they're kind of in that conversation. I'm trying to think here if there's another offense that has comparable receivers, and
Oregon would be the other one,
right? So maybe it's going to be the 3rd best group of receivers Oregon will face all year. And honestly, like if you want to look at it as what does it prepare you for, it could be a game that does prepare you for the types of offenses and the types of talent out wide that you'll see in the big games to end the season for sure. I don't know. I don't know if there's anything else offensively that I had.
Watching the game against Wyoming, it was clear that Texas Tech is, A, they're probably not going to try to run the ball, and B, it's because they can't really run the ball. I thought it was interesting that Shough had, I think, 13 or 14 carries against Wyoming. They run him a little bit more than I had anticipated. Some of that's, the scramble, and maybe a scramble by design, but there were a decent amount of designed run plays, especially during that 4th quarter where they were trying to come back in the game. So I think that's something that Texas Tech is going to play to their full advantage, because Oregon's going to be focused on all the guys we just ran through, because that's a good unit. That's going to be a lot of guys who can get open, especially in an air raid offense. We've all seen it with Washington State and Mike Leach beforehand. But Shough was a good runner. I don't remember how many yards he had during the game, but he had some critical 2nd and 3rd down conversions in that 4th quarter as they were trying to get into field goal range to tie it and send it to overtime. So I was a bit surprised by that, and I think that's certainly going to be an element of Tech's offense that comes into fruition on Saturday. As for the receivers, I think it's just going to be a fun matchup. I think, we talked about this before Portland State. We talked about this after Portland State. Like, this is going to be the game that really gives us an idea if Oregon's pass defense has improved from a season ago. It's not a great offensive line for Texas Tech, but the nice thing is for them is they're going to look to get the ball out early. So how good is Oregon's rush going to be? How good is their pass defense going to look? Especially against these receivers and tight ends, it's going to be a challenge. But after Portland State, like, there's nothing to really go on for Oregon's pass defense. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they look like, because then we'll have a good idea and see if they can match up to the Washingtons and the USCs and the Oregon States of the world.
I did have sorry, I just was going to say one more thing on the run game. In the opener, 17 carries between running backs for 59 yards. So not a productive day. Last year, I was surprised. I actually looked at it. They threw it on 52% of downs, but that also means they ran it on 48, which is closer to a 50-50 split than I had thought it would be.
Did I freeze?
Yes.
Okay.
No, you just stopped.
You're back.
I'm back. Defensively, it looks like everything starts with Josiah Pierre, their will linebacker. Had 14 tackles against Wyoming in week 1. Now, some of that maybe could be because of a double OT, but nonetheless, 14 is still 14, and that's still pretty darn impressive. They run a 3-3-5 defense. Tim DeRuyter, former Oregon defensive coordinator, is their defensive coordinator. Kind of similar to what Oregon ran with him here, a little bit different, but that's what Dan Lanning talked about on Monday night, was that, hey, yeah, like, I'm sure there's things that they did at Oregon that he's now doing at Texas Tech. But then he also pointed out that he's seen things on film that they didn't do at all at Oregon under Tim DeRuyter that they're now doing at Texas Tech. It's going to be interesting to see how Oregon faces off against this defense. A 3-3-5 is unique. It's different. We've seen teams previously. The one that most notably comes to mind is just Washington State, that runs a funky defense, and it gives previous Oregon teams under different coaching staffs nonetheless. So you have to factor that in. Fits. It's just a unique, different defense, and the first couple series can always be interesting.
I mean, Oregon plays out of a 3-3-5 a decent amount, so there's some familiarity. I'll be curious to see how different this looks to when DeRuyter was here, because it was funny because when Dan was talking about all the exotic blitz packages and how creative they got, I was like, oh, that does sound different than when DeRuyter was here.
Yeah, they didn't do any of that. Yeah,
I was gonna say, the player that really stood out when I was doing the kind of a run through was their cornerback, Malik Dunlap, who's the only returning all Big 12 player. He's a 6'3", 220-pound corner. So that's a very large player to play at that position. He's a sixth-year senior. He transferred from NC State, so veteran guy. But that's just a very large human being on the outside operating. I will be curious to see if he draws Troy Franklin, if he has the athleticism to stay with him, and just in general, who's guarding Troy Franklin is going to be something I think we talk a lot about this year going into matchups. They also start a true freshman at safety, Brendan Johnson. So that'll be interesting to see how he holds up, just because freshmen playing out in the field that early on in their career against high-end offenses can sometimes cause some problems. They do not, from what I've seen, have in terms of what challenges they're going to put on Oregon's offensive line. I don't know if they're going to, at least in the opener, they didn't really inspire a lot of confidence that they can get home very frequently. They had 2 sacks. They also had several hurries, but I'll be curious to see that part, because a year ago, Bo was very, very rarely impacted at all by any defenses. Is Texas Tech one of the teams that can change that? Probably a little skeptical, even with an offensive line that looks a lot different than I did a year ago.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of that as well. Coach McGuire had some interesting quotes about their rush lanes after the game. He called them horrific. He was rather disappointed in his defensive line. So I would expect them to play a lot harder, and not that they weren't playing harder against Wyoming, but like come out with your hair on fire, home crowd, all that type of stuff. So, it wouldn't shock me if they got to the quarterback early in the game. But the nice thing for Oregon is, at least in what I think, is that they didn't show a lot in their offense.
Yeah.
They I think I talked about this either yesterday or on Saturday after the game. Like, Bo didn't run at all. They didn't do any design runs. He didn't scramble. Like, we're going to see Bo Nix as we saw him last year when he was healthy, the ability to scramble and get out of sack situations and make plays down the field against a secondary who wasn't really tested against Wyoming. There were moments, but it was not the same as what an Oregon offense should be able to do and against this Tech defense. Texas Tech is also without their, I think, second or third string linebacker, Jacob Rodriguez. He played the third most amount of snaps for a middle linebacker against Wyoming. He's out for like 4 to 6 weeks, but he plays more of an outside linebacker role, which could lead to our friend Terrell Tillman, former Oregon Duck, getting some snaps against his old team. I wanted to get to like the base, the 3-3-5 base. It's going to be very advantageous for Oregon in the running game. Sure. If there's only 3 down linemen, and depending on the size of their outside linebackers who are playing one of the 3 in the 3s, there could be a day where Oregon could run the ball quite frequently, because I think Oregon's offensive line, I know they're replacing a bunch of guys. I think that's a good unit. I think they're going to be able to play with the best of them this year in the Pac-12. And it'll be interesting to see what Tim DeRuyter does. I mean, Oregon could just 1,000 cuts like with a bunch of slants all day long. That seemed to have worked in Tim DeRuyter's tenure here at Oregon. So maybe that happens this time around as well. But again, I'm personally, I'm excited to see what Oregon's offense looks like against a real defense, because this is going to be a true test. And again, not to keep being mean to Portland State here, but that was not a real team. Texas Tech is going to be a much more opponent. Yeah. Just I feel bad for the program. They tried. They got $650,000 to come down and get their butts kicked, and that's exactly what happened.
And to clarify, like, Dan wasn't being he wasn't poking fun at Portland State. He said they'll probably be good at the FCS level, but they're not an FBS team and they're not of our caliber, and it wasn't a good test for us, or it wasn't a good matchup.
It wasn't a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to make it seem like Dan was just like being outrageously, cocky, but he was also factually correct in his statement. He did it in a very good way. But yeah, I agree. Like, we'll learn a lot more about this one. Dan himself has said that, and the cuts and slants that you mentioned, Jared, that's a good point. We might see a quick pass game with Oregon this game. We'll certainly have to talk more with Jarrett about that and just get his feel for the matchups between the Red Raiders and the Ducks offensively and defensively. And I'm excited to get down there, especially now that we pray that our credentials are going to be approved. That we should be there. It was funny today. We learned that no one in the Oregon media had submitted credentials, and we were all operating under like a 4-hour timeline.
We never received the link, and then we were told, oh yeah, you have like 3 hours to get this to him. Okay, we did.
Yeah. So hopefully we're there. I mean, we've all got. Hopefully we can get into the stadium. We should be able to get in one way or the other. But yeah, this is going to do it for us on this edition of the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Tomorrow we'll dive in deep with our Texas Tech site to. Today we'll have our show where we'll predict the outcome, give some other predictions. We'll update the tracker for who did well. I know Jared did very well against Portland State. And then next time after that, you'll hear from us is late Saturday night from Red Raiders, their stadium after that game is over, win or lose. So that's what you got looking forward to this week on the podcast. And if you're listening Tuesday and it's not midnight on Tuesday, September 5th, you can get advantage of that. You can take advantage of that 50% off promo that we're running right now for an annual subscription. The last few hours of that are going on right now. It's going to do it for us, though, here on the Autzen Audibles Podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.